Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and this is another Liberate Raleigh video. Today I'm going to do the fourth video in the immigration series, where I will be discussing the topics of government immigration programs and forced integration. These are two fairly common objections to open and free immigration that a number of libertarians will bring up. What they say is there are government programs which are taking tax resources from people, and they use these resources to move people from other countries into the United States and place them in areas and so on and so forth. And there's also the forced immigration aspect of this, in that people are unable to discriminate against other folks in the country on their own property. There are anti-discrimination laws in place, and so they can't choose to not associate with certain people that they may not want to associate with, which under self-ownership and private property rights on their own property, they should be allowed to not associate with whoever they wish. So the argument goes, because the government is using immigration, the movement of people from outside the country into the country, as a means to violate people's rights through forced integration and through these government programs, then immigration should be restricted on those grounds. I touched on this in the very first video, applying property rights, the first part of this, the government immigration programs, when I pointed out that indeed these programs are criminal in the sense that, yes, the government is stealing money from people and using them for their own ends. But And yes, these programs should be ended, but it's important to remember that the reason why these programs should be ended is because they're government programs, not specifically that they're immigration programs. The fact that they're immigration programs is irrelevant to the reasoning behind why they should be ended. So the correct remedy here is, yes, those programs should be ended, but this says nothing regarding whether people should be free to enter the country of their own accord, and whether people within the country should be allowed to, on their own property and so on and so forth, be able to have guests or business partners and such. And it also says nothing regarding the status of the illegitimate government borders. So on that point, I've covered that earlier. I also would like to just make another point relating to that here. If you're talking about government programs and you're objecting on those grounds, if you're objecting to immigration on those grounds that, well, immigration is the government making use of government programs to move people into the country, then and therefore we need to end immigration. There is the converse of this, in that the prevention of immigration, as would be implemented under what these anti-immigration libertarians propose, that the government should restrict immigration into the country. That is also a government program. That's all it could be. And the only way to keep people from crossing a government border is for the government to utilize its taxation and police enforcement resources to forcibly prevent people from walking across that border, and to prevent them from associating with people within the country. So what you end up with is, here you simply have another government program, or a significant expansion of an existing government program. So if you're objecting to immigration on those grounds, and you must also logically object to the prevention of immigration on those grounds. Well, the problem here is, in neither cases, the purpose of the program is not the issue. People are free to not allow people on their property or to disassociate with other people, and they are free to associate with people if they so choose. That's not the issue. What is at issue is that the government is using stolen resources via taxation to implement these programs, and that is the violation of people's rights. So all of these programs, both any program that seeks to move people into the country or to prevent people from moving into the country, done by the government, should be ended. And they should be ended on the grounds that, again, the criminal enterprise known as the government is the one implementing those programs. In addition, I'd like to look at the forced integration aspect of this. This is, again, another criminal activity of the government by not allowing people to not associate with who they wish to associate with or not associate with freely. And the government has a number of laws in places that prevent people from being able to do so. I've also seen libertarians make the case that due to public property is a means of forced integration. I've dealt with the public property aspect of this in a previous video. But if you look at the forced integration aspect of it, then what you end up with is you have people that are forced to deal with other folks that they would prefer not to. And the anti-immigration libertarians try to make the case that, well, because of this, we need to prevent this forced integration by restricting immigration. So the government should, the more libertarian policy is to have the government restrict immigration. But the problem here is this doesn't remedy forced integration. People still are unable to discriminate or freely associate with who they wish just because the government is preventing or restricting immigration. All it does is create another layer of rights violations against people who wish to associate with foreigners from outside the country. So if the government prevented immigration, people within the country still would be unable to discriminate against people within the country. Those laws, which are rights violations, still exist. But on top of that, you have the further rights violations of people being unable to freely associate with other people from outside the country. So it doesn't remedy anything. It simply adds further problems and further criminal actions by the government against the people. Another thing that is important to look at is if you're objecting to forced integration, which you should. I mean, forced integration is bad, but if your remedy is to prevent immigration from people outside the country, what you have to understand is that forced integration does not merely apply to people from outside the country coming into the country. It applies to you and somebody on the other side of the country, on the other side of the state, on the other side of the county, city, other side of the street. So again, we have another situation where the anti-immigration position is arbitrarily limited only to people outside the country. If you're going to make the argument that forced integration should be prevented by having the government restrict the free movement of people, then it should be, and logically, another consequence of this argument is that the government should be managing and restricting the free movement of people within its borders, of its own citizens. So the government should be preventing people from Detroit moving to I live in the city of Raleigh, if it so chooses. If some people decide, well, we don't, if a group of people within the city of Raleigh decide, well, we want to not associate with people from Detroit, then there's no reasoned grounds, if you've already accepted that restricting immigration is the proper remedy through government action. Restricting immigration through government action is a proper remedy for forced integration. Then you have to also accept that the government should be managing the movement of people within the country, whether they're citizens or not. Then they could, if they want to force people to pick up and move somewhere else, or force people to move here inside the country from one city to another, then all of these things are admissible given the logic being applied in the case of forced integration. So again, many of these anti-immigration arguments become obviously silly once you apply them, extend them to the universality. You apply them universally to everybody, and don't just arbitrarily restrict them to people outside the country. So here, again, the proper remedy is no government management of integration or segregation or government programs, or the execution of government programs. A further point I'd like to make here regarding immigration programs is you'll hear a lot of people, anti-immigration libertarians, make reference to mass immigration in other countries. For example, European countries, or mass immigration into the U.S., and that the governments are using using immigration to force, forced integration of peoples inside their borders, and so on and so forth. And they use this as, arguments against open borders or free movement and association of people. Another point and it's a very important point, I think, to remember, is that these governments, none of them have open borders policies. So it's a straw man to use them as examples of what will happen if an open borders policy is implemented, given that none of these countries have open borders. You can't simply pack up and move to Germany, for example, without jumping through a whole bunch of hoops and immigration hoops and so on and so forth. I actually know somebody that recently moved to Germany, and she has to constantly apply for things in her visa. I don't know what her visa status is currently, but I know that she has to engage in a whole lot of paperwork and a lot of different things just to be able to stay in the country. And again, another restriction is that people cannot simply come to the country and work. You can't come to the United States and just start working. You can't, I'm not actually aware of any country on the planet where you can just pack up, go there, and start working. So to use these as examples against open immigration, when in fact these are not open borders countries, these are not free immigration countries. They are countries where the movement of people is greatly managed and restricted by the government so that it can be controlled by the government for its own benefit. Those are not criticisms of open borders policies or free immigration and free association of people. Another thing that I want to talk about is there was a recent podcast where Tom Woods was Tom Woods was on Stefan Molyneux's podcast. I haven't listened to this, but I've read a quote from Tom Woods that somebody who is an anti-immigration libertarian brought up. And I have a feeling that this might turn into a bit of a talking point for people that are against immigration and also claim to be libertarians. He was talking about Stalin immigrating people into, I believe, the Baltic states. And Tom Woods was making the point that Stalin wasn't just doing this haphazardly, that this immigration, and he was relating this to current immigration policies, that it's a deliberate attempt to create internal problems in the country which the government will then step in to solve. So this is, I mean, again, this is accurate. Governments are awful at managing their programs, and they do indeed implement these programs and use them to create problems which they use as justification for further interventions into the economy and other areas. So this goes back to something that von Mises said. Ludwig von Mises, the wonderful economist in the Austrian school, he said that there is no shortage of problems in the world, and so governments will use those problems. I mean, that's simply the nature of an imperfect existence, is that, yes, these problems exist, and the government can use these as excuses to intervene and restrict the freedom of people. But of course, by doing so, this simply creates more problems, which the government will then use as excuses to further step in and further restrict people's freedom, and so on and so forth. So this is correct. What Tom Woods is saying is correct. I agree with this. What I do not agree with is the logical step beyond this that says, well, the solution is that immigration should be restricted because the government managed immigration by the government creates problems. No, the correct remedy here is an open borders policy, because an open borders policy necessitates no government intervention. That's the only policy that necessitates no government intervention. Otherwise, by restricting immigration, the government is, again, stepping in and interfering in the state of affairs. Another thing is that, yes, again, I agree with Tom Woods that these are used as excuses to create further problems, but one problem that I think that needs to be addressed here, one problem that the government could be and probably is attempting to create, for which it is creating an excuse to further solve, is actually the quote-unquote problem of immigration into the country. So yeah, the government has these programs, and again, I agree they are creating problems, but again, the government can use this as an excuse to further restrict immigration into the country, which necessitates an expansion of its power. If you read comments from people that want to restrict immigration, they have a number of different ideas on how to enforce this. And I'm not saying necessarily that libertarians make these arguments. I'm simply bringing this up. I'm going to bring these up as examples of what is likely to happen and what further rights violations you can expect if you, as a libertarian, say, yes, let's have the government restrict immigration. So many people think that, again, first of all, you are necessarily arguing for an expansion of the police power of the state to police the borders and prevent people from entering the country. But you're also arguing for greater policing and oppression of people of citizens living within the country. One way that I see this from one idea of a program or a way of restricting immigration or getting illegal immigrants out of the country is to crack down on business owners. This is something I see a lot. People will say, well, if we took away their jobs, then they wouldn't come here. So their remedy is to have the government clamp down on businesses so that businesses won't hire illegal immigrants and they just won't come to the country. But of course, here we have a dramatic expansion of government regulatory and policing power within the country against its citizens. So the remedy is worse than the problem. You maintain all of the previous rights violations that were present prior to the further restriction of immigration, but on top of it you have further rights violations caused by the government stepping in to further prevent free association of immigration into the country. Now, of course, again, I want to reiterate that the correct remedy, the correct solution here, as it always is with any government program, is the elimination of government interference. It's to completely get the government out of the business of determining who enters the country, who leaves the country, who moves around within the country. That's the correct solution. Then you would have free association of people, which would dramatically reduce internal cultural strife within the country and would just be an economic boon overall. So ultimately, all of these arguments relating to immigration as a government program and forced integration of the government fail and are counterproductive as far if you have libertarian goals, or actually anti-libertarian. It's an anti-libertarian position, even based on the immigration as a government program and forced integration line of reasoning. And again, the proper libertarian solution here is free movement, free association, and to use the common term, an open borders immigration policy. So this is the end of the fourth video in the immigration series, and I think I'm going to settle on a total of 7. But anyway, that's it for this video. I hope it was interesting and informative, and I will see you guys in the next video.